Good afternoon. Welcome to the CPS ECP presentation. Every conference we have a guest speaker, and this time we've got one from within our own organisation. This year we have a remarkable sailor to bring to your attention. You'll have seen his voyage reports to the porthole or his blog during the summer, but now we have him in the virtual flesh to talk to us from Gabriola Island, to tell us how he achieved his amazing solo around the world voyage and answer questions. Bert joined Gabriola Island Squadron in 2008 after successful completion of the boating course. Bert and his son Alex did the course together under the watchful eye of Ralph Hagen. Bert had completed a career as a soldier, citizen scientist, serial entrepreneur and adventurer. Among the talents of a varied past was a master's in photography and a willingness and ability to jump out of serviceable aircraft. For those of you who have the misfortune to live in the middle of this great country and have to take your boats out of the water every winter, a quick guide to the left side of the country, the BC side of the country, may be necessary. Just off the west coast, just north of the border with the United States, lies Vancouver Island. About halfway up the island on the right side is the city of Nanaimo. Gabriola Island lies just east of Nanaimo, a 30-minute ferry ride. The Gabriola Island Squadron of CPS ECP is a small but lively group of some 60 members who enjoy teaching safe boating, seamanship and navigation skills, or how to get you back again to where you started. Bert achieved that on a grand scale. He rose through the ranks of Gabriola Squadron to become the Squadron Education Officer and taught classes as well as organising the training programme. Bert has a 1987 well-travelled OCY 45 sailboat called Sea Bourbon, and she took him and Mr. Salty, his mascot, around the 5 Great Capes from Victoria, BC, and back to where he started. And in doing so, he fulfilled a lifetime ambition. Those of you who attended our last annual conference in Victoria, BC, will remember well the quality and the quantity of the rain that soaked us every time we set foot outside the Empress Hotel. Bert's departure was delayed several days by the weather that brought this rain, so he didn't leave until 11:30 on the 27th of October 2019. Bert completed his voyage through sometimes mountainous seas, navigating as the seamen of 300 and 400 years ago did. As Bert will no doubt explain, the Roaring Forties is well named. Bert sailed from west to east, navigating with a compass, a sextant, celestial tables, a logbook, charts, pencil and paper and watch. No calculator, no GPS. And he became the first North American and the 5th person ever to achieve this remarkable feat. Bert returned to Victoria at 12:30 on the 18th of July 2020 as the most socially isolated man in the country after a 265-day, 28,840 nautical mile voyage to a welcome from his nanny, his family and friends. So sit back and enjoy the adventure of a lifetime. Please welcome Bert terHart, Senior Navigator of Gabriola Island Squadron. Over to you, Bert.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say a very deep and heartfelt thank you to the Chief Commander Peter Bolton for the invite and the opportunity to speak with you today. It's something I'm very honored and I feel very privileged to do, and I'm deeply grateful, like I said, for the invite. It's a real honor to speak to my fellow boaters, navigators, and colleagues. And one of the reasons I'm so engaged with the Power Squadron is because I feel very strongly about the mission, which is to teach safe boating in every possible context you can imagine. So the context that I'm speaking about today is my trip around the world. I traveled solo nonstop via the 5 Great Capes using only traditional navigational tools. And the 5 Great Capes include Cape Horn, Cape Agulhas, Cape Leeuwin, Southeast Cape, and South Cape off of New Zealand. It is no mean feat, let's say. So what I'm really talking about, and what I want to bring today is, with respect to some aspect of the trip, is that what I'm really talking about are limits. And it doesn't matter how you define your limits. Limits involve some sort of push, some sort of push outside your comfort zone. No matter how you describe a goal, it's representative of some kind of some kind of limit. And what I'm talking about today is not going to be a long list of cliches, slogans, or virtual high fives or hand waving. It's going to be about something you can use immediately, something that you can use no matter what the situation is. And I warn you, there will be quotes. I like quotes, and there's going to be a lot of them. So if you don't believe what I have to say, maybe people like Einstein or Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, or perhaps Michael Jordan or some other people, maybe some of that will ring true. So I learned in the Army that one of the most important things you're supposed to do is ask a good question. If you ask a good question, you tend to get a good answer. So I'm hoping you're asking the question, why should I care? If you can answer that question, why should I care, or why should I bother being here, then I think we're going to be on the same page. Well, firstly, here's why. First, I'm going to talk about what it takes to function when the chips are down. And when I mean when the chips are down, I mean when it really, really matters. The decisions you make are literally life and death, and that's not hyperbole. That's fact. And I have the things what I'm going to share with you today. Firstly, are something you can rely on no matter how difficult the circumstances. And in order for that to work, it has to be brain dead simple. Otherwise, I couldn't do it. So that's number one. And number two, I'm going to talk about celestial navigation, and what in particular I did with respect to CellNav to be able to do it, because in the conditions I was in, celestial navigation by itself is really, really, really tough. And there's some certain tweaks that I'm sure most of you guys who are familiar with celestial navigation have never heard of. So I hope to share that with you today and hopefully inspire you to actually pick that up. So I learned to sail actually on Boundary Dam in Estevan, Saskatchewan. And Estevan, Saskatchewan is in the very southeastern corner of the province, and the only body of water nearby is a small reservoir. And I learned to sail. My father taught me. He taught my brother and my sisters when we were very young. So I've been sailing since I was about 7 or 8 years old. And the lessons I learned sailing on a small body of water, sailing small boats like lasers, fins, enterprises, and anything else that as a kid you could put a sail on and sail across the dam with, then those lessons have stayed with me throughout my entire sailing career. And some of those lessons I learned way back when sailing a small boat are some of the most important and fundamental skills you can possibly have. So never ever underestimate the skills required to, or never underestimate the applicability of small boat handling. And of course, we're talking about sailboats in particular. Well, the other thing that sailing has allowed me to do is indulge my passion for the sciences. I have a master's degree, as Peter said, in physical oceanography and physics, and I urge anyone with a passion in any field to seek out the local scientific community and get involved, because some of the greatest contributions to science have been made by citizen scientists, and some of them I'm sure you know, like Charles Darwin and Albert Einstein. So what does sailing around the world by yourself and doing citizen scientists have to do with anything that's remotely related to Boundary Dam or the very nearly impossible? And I left Victoria on October 27th, 2019, and the question immediately anyone asks is why? And what does a mind-bending, near-suicidal attempt at the virtual impossibility or the virtual impossible have to do with anything other than crazy? And when I told my dad I was going to do this, that was exactly what he said. He said, quote, "I thought you were smarter than that." And it was probably the most insightful comment I'd heard. It's far better than, "Oh, you've got this," or you can do it. I thought you were smarter than that is leads you immediately to think, what have you done to prepare yourself for one of the most difficult, one of the most dangerous things a human can attempt from any number of perspectives. And I made it even harder by choosing to use only traditional navigational tools. So that's no electronic position finding at all. And that kind of attempt is almost unheard of. So this is what a solar circumnavigation looks like on a world map. It took me 265 days. I traveled 29,000 or close to 29,000 nautical miles, and I did it entirely on my own. And 265 days at sea translates basically into 9 months of unrelenting deprivation, isolation, and starvation. At one point, just to make sure that I had enough food to come home, I was eating less than 800 or just about 800 calories a day. And bear in mind that at any time, you are one step away from oblivion, day and night, continuously, no matter what the weather. Doing anything outside and sometimes inside means crawling around on all fours. And it's not so much from being, you do that not so much to be tossed off the boat, because if you get tossed off the boat, then it's over relatively quickly. But if you're not crawling around very, very carefully in your hands and knees, then you risk injury, and getting injured is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. I mean, bear in mind that the trip it covers thousands, at any one time, you're thousands of miles from the nearest land. Fully 2/3 of the trip is in and through one of the harshest, most extreme, most violent marine environments on the planet. Help, let alone rescue, is virtually impossible, because the nearest human is on the International Space Station, about 2,000 miles that way. You are continually fatigued. I never slept more than 2 hours at any one stretch, and I never slept more than 4 hours in one 24-hour period for the entire 9 months. And I fell asleep standing up, sitting down, steering, grinding a winch, eating, navigating, sending emails. As soon as you stopped doing anything, you're so tired that your whole system just wants to shut down. I mean, I ate just about every meal standing up, because it takes 2 hands to eat, one for the bowl and one for the spoon. And you simply need to wedge yourself into the boat, certainly in the Southern Ocean, because the motion on the boat is so incredibly extreme. So you're basically under the gun for 9 unrelenting months to perform at the highest possible standard, and there's no reprieve. The mental and physical challenges of doing that are probably beyond what most people can imagine enduring. And I don't want to make this sound like hyperbole. So here's what it looks like basically in terms of numbers. Like, just, I've said it's hard, but just how hard is it? Well, here's a bit of perspective. The first man to walk on the moon did so in 1969, which was the same year that the first man was able to complete the first solo nonstop circumnavigation. His name, of course, was Sir Robin, or now knighted for the attempt, and others for his now Sir Robin Knox Johnson. He finished that trip in April 1969 after having spent 312 days at sea. And only a few months later, Neil Armstrong in July walked on the moon. So in 1969, it was considered every bit as hard to sail around the world by yourself by the 5 Great Capes as it was to get to the moon and back. Both are, even today, both are the same level of difficulty. It's every bit as hard to get to the moon and back, and it's every bit as hard to sail around the world nonstop. So by the numbers then, about 6,000, to make it maybe a little more relatable, about 6,000 people have summited Everest, and about 600 people have been in space, and something like 300 people have sailed around the world nonstop by themselves. And up until 2018, only 3 people, and of course it's 9 now, I'm one of the 9 people have sailed around the world nonstop using only celestial navigation, and only 1 North American, and I happen to be that one. And if you're not motivated by something, or maybe extreme adventure doesn't really resonate with you, but how about money then? How about fiscally? If you just look at in Canada, so the orange bars represent Canada. In Canada, there's 1.3 millionaires. There's something like 44 billionaires, and there's only one guy who sailed around the world nonstop using only celestial navigation. So what that translates to statistically is that you are more likely to win Lotto 649 4 times in a row than you are to sail around the world nonstop using only celestial navigation, because worldwide there's 46.8 million millionaires. So again, you're more likely to sail around the world, or you're more likely to win the lottery 4 times consecutively than you are to complete what I had done. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, then perhaps this might. I didn't expect this, but it turns out it's a very big deal to sail around the world. I was covered by, over the course of the challenge, and when I finished, I had appeared in media everywhere from locally, provincially, nationally, and internationally. And how did I do it? Like, I'm an average sailor, relatively inexperienced, and I certainly am not one of the exalted professional rock star-esque sailing icons that are world famous in sailing circles. As an example, I would not be able to walk down the street in Les Sables-d'Olonne in France, where the Vendée Globe is leaving in just a couple of weeks, without being recognized and stopped. Because in France, solo sailors are the equivalent of professional hockey players or professional baseball players here in North America. I was featured in the largest sailing magazine in Europe with a circulation of something like 1.5 million. They did a feature article on the circumnavigation. So, I mean, I have hardly any of the experience that these guys have. So the fact that there was so much media relates to how difficult it is to actually finish. Now, to motivate this, the press didn't motivate me by any stretch of the imagination. I have to admit, there's some satisfaction in proving everybody wrong and succeeding against all succeeding against all the odds, and especially the odds makers themselves. But that still isn't why. And I've been, like I mentioned, I've been interviewed by dozens and dozens of reporters, but they all ask, universally, they all ask the same questions, and the questions aren't necessarily the best question to ask. Over the course of the trip, I was followed by some 2,500 students, and primarily in elementary schools ranging from Kenya to New York to New Zealand to Australia, of course, Canada, the United States. And universally, the kids ask the same. They ask the really good questions. And the best one is, and they always asked it almost universally right off the top, was, weren't you afraid? And the answer is, of course you're afraid. You'd be a psychopath at best or a sociopath at worst if you weren't afraid. So how do you deal with that? And that, my friends, is the crux of the matter. Dealing with fear, aloud and effectively dealing with fear, knowing full well that you're going to be scared out of your mind, is the secret to not only me completing this trip, but also achieving just about any goal that you can imagine. So this is the first slide. Remember, I set out, why are you here? Why bother? So how is it that I was able to achieve the nearly impossible? How did I do it when the stakes were so high and my experience was incredibly limited? Well, one of the things, I've come to call it the navigator's ethos. And I want to talk today about the 4 simple things that you can do to start you down the path that leads inexorably and unequivocally to success. And whenever you set a goal for yourself, I don't care how big or small it is, it takes a certain amount of courage, and it takes a lot of courage to reach way beyond your comfort zone. And it takes perhaps even more to reach way beyond the comfort zone of nearly everyone on the planet. And like I said, I'm talking in context of this circumnavigation, but what I'm really referring to is anything. And I can tell you most sincerely that my hat is off to anyone who's willing to go anywhere in a small boat, no matter what size the body of water, because as soon as you step off the boat, you can't walk on it and you can't breathe it. So you're in trouble almost immediately. So hats off to anyone who's going to get a small boat and do anywhere. And what I want to share with you today, this navigator's ethos, is those things that you can do or that you must do to achieve whatever goal it is you set out for yourself. And again, in my context, it was the circumnavigation. So what are the 4 things? What are the 4 cornerstones? Number 1, you have to plan. And whether your plans are good or bad, they will lay the foundation of your success, whatever that success might be, whether it be big or small. And you have to, of course, plan for failure, because you will not always be right, and everything you do is not going to work. So there is no excuse for not having some kind of plan. Like I said, I don't care how good or bad it is. And as an officer in the Army, everyone has to read the Art of War. And here's a really, really, really good way to look at it in terms of our perspective, in terms of teaching safe boating. You need to plan for what is difficult while it is easy, and do what is great while it is small. You think about that for a minute. It just makes an incredible amount of sense. Why would you plan for something while your back is up against the wall? So, well before I went, I had read every single account of every single-handed voyage I could possibly find. I read everything I could possibly find about getting into and sailing in the Southern Ocean. I planned for specific weather patterns because I knew where I was going to be sailing. I planned for every possible methodology of short form navigation, celestial navigation. So short form, I mean no calculator, no electronic tools. I planned very, very specifically for light weather sailing tactics, for heavy weather sailing tactics, for weather forecasting, and for weather routing. And in order to do this, and this is something whenever I've been teaching boating, I've always focused on something that I call the when game. It's something that we learned to do in the Army as well. If you play the what if game, for example, what if the mast falls down, or what if the rudder falls off the boat, or what if there's a giant hole in the side? If you play the what if game, humans, which are hardwired to be incredibly optimistic, they will universally assign a very low probability of the what if event happening. And if there's a very low probability, we'll just automatically wave our hands and say, well, it's never going to happen. If you play the when game, then you have a completely different mindset, and your mind plays a completely different trick on you. So when you say when the mast falls down, or when the rudder falls off, or when there's a leak in the boat, or when when the self-steering fails, then you assign, it's no longer a probability, it becomes a fact. So then you have to deal with whatever that fact is. And again, to relate, no one ever asks, what if I win the lottery? They say, when I win the lottery. Because if you ask, what if I win the lottery, the chances are extremely small. You know that's not going to happen, so you wouldn't spend the $5, the $10 or $20 it costs for a ticket. Everyone says, when I win the lottery, when. It's the when game. And one way to look at this, well, another quote, because I like quotes. Einstein, the Albert Einstein, says, plans are nothing, planning is everything. Plans are nothing, planning is everything. And when you play the when game, then you play the planning is everything game. Number two, you must prepare, which is to say that you must do everything in your power to make sure that your vessel and equipment are prepared for the worst that you can imagine. Because I can guarantee you, absolutely, that the worst you can imagine doesn't come close to reality. So every system on the boat that you can that's critical to keeping the water keeping the water on one side of the hull and you on the other, and every system that's there to keep you alive has to be absolutely and completely bomb-proof. And you must do everything in your power to do that. There's hundreds of incidents of people abandoning boats and then finding the boat months later drifting perfectly fine. So I knew that if I could keep the water on one side and me on the other, then there was a very good chance that I would come back alive. So I did everything humanly possible to get the boat prepared. And Nani and I, my beautiful, dedicated, understanding wife, and I started to do this in January of 2019. We started in earnest to prepare the boat. I mean, we've had this boat for a long time. I knew the boat really well. I had a very good idea of what needed to be done, and what needed to be done was everything. So Nani and I left no stone unturned in preparing Suburban to make sure that it was absolutely and utterly prepared for what I would foresee to be the conditions I was going to experience in the Southern Ocean. So the standing rigging got redone, the running rigging, the furling, the reefing systems, the light air sail handling, heavy air sail handling, DC power systems, storm management tactics and systems, and of course, self-steering. So we either repaired, replaced, or overhauled everything we possibly could do in the time that we had and within the budget to make sure that the boat was utterly prepared. And this is one of the this is what has drawn me to the Power Squadron for as many years as I've been involved, and that is the mandate is to teach safe boating, which in my mind translates to practice. And there is absolutely no excuse whatsoever for not taking every opportunity to hone and perfect the fundamental skills required to handle your vessel in the foreseeable conditions. There is absolutely none, no, zero, nada, nilch. There is no excuse for not knowing how to handle your boat. And I'm not talking handling your boat in the Southern Ocean. I'm talking about simple things like docking and anchoring and furling and reefing. I remember teaching celestial navigation, and one of the questions I asked, who here knows how to heave to? Because they were all planning to go offshore, and not a single hand went up, which of course to me was shocking, because there's no way in the world that you should leave the dock on a sailboat if you don't know how to park it. And that's how you park a sailboat, you heave to. So that's a fundamental skill that you have to have. And you can do them, you don't have to go offshore to do it. You can practice docking or anchoring or furling or reefing in your backyard. And in the Army, we used to say that you don't rise to the occasion, you simply fall back to your level of training. It's completely and totally, it's lunacy to think that when the chips are down and your back is against the wall, you, like Superman, are going to rise to some exalted state of performance. That just doesn't happen. You simply fall back to what you know. And whatever your level of training is, however abysmal that might be, that's where you end up. So how would you like, for example, to have the person flying you from, say, Vancouver to Tokyo to be the least experienced pilot in Air Canada? How would you like that person to be the least experienced pilot, the most poorly trained pilot in the cockpit? I think every one of us would say, no, we would probably prefer to have the most well-trained, the most well-practiced, the most current senior pilot driving. So, well, here's a quote: the more you sweat in practice, the less you bleed in battle. No one knows who that quote is from, but it's something you can take to heart. And Michael Jordan once said, get the fundamentals down and the level of everything you do will rise. So I firmly believe that. And I think that's at the core of what the Power Squadron is all about. And lastly, and most importantly, you have to persist. And the way that I think about persistence is probably not the way that you might think about persistence. So no matter how daunting, difficult, dangerous, or dire your situation is, you can always and absolutely think of something, one thing that you can do right now, the one most simple, the simplest, the most basic, the most elementary thing that you can do right now to get you moving forward, because you have to be moving forward in a direction that you believe is correct. And of course, circumstances are going to sort you out if things are wrong, but the point is you've got to be moving all the time. And progress, I sailed around the world, 29,000 nautical miles, at basically a very slow walk. So progress is never measured in leaps and bounds. It's measured in bits, and bits add to bunches, bunches to bags, and bags to bucket fill. So you need to always doing something to improve your chances. And this particular picture was taken while I was in Port Stanley, and the wind from the shore with a giant zoom. I had no idea the picture was being taken, actually. And that's me on the front of the boat, doing what I have to do to stop the tiny little road. I shouldn't say tiny, it's a proper road for the boat, but that tiny little piece of rope, strand, piece of dental floss, it seemed to me at the time, from chafing through at the anchor rollers. The wind is blowing 65 plus knots. The swell is 2 meters and greater, and I had patched together anchors and rode and chain because I'd left everything, of course, all the storm anchoring gear, the stuff I would use up in Alaska, at home, because I wasn't going to be anchored. So I did plan for this eventuality. I never thought it would happen, but I did have a plan and a plan in place for it. So I patched together what was necessary to keep me off the rocks. And this picture was taken before it got windy. This was well before it got to be really, really windy. So in a general context, when you're paralyzed with fear, with the wind literally tearing at the sails and the rig, and the boat mostly underwater with waves hammering and pounding the boat hard enough to sweep the topsides clean, the only thing that you're thinking of is that you are alive now, and whatever you're doing is good enough. It's the equivalent of what economists call activity inertia, and the best run companies in the world, no matter big or small, are systematically plagued with activity inertia, which is to say that they recognize that there's trouble, and almost universally they respond by doing what's working now. They just do it in a more energetic fashion. It's the equivalent of running in front of an accelerating car. If you run faster, you're still going to get run over. It just might take a little bit longer, but inevitably you will be run over. The only thing you can do to stop from getting run over is to do something abruptly different, which is to change direction 90 degrees and head off in a different way. The soldier the soldier's analogy is called shoot and scoot, and as soon as you fire your weapon, then you immediately give away your position. And if you stay in that same spot, you most certainly will be shot. But the problem is that you're safe now, and doing anything other than what's working now, which is staying safe, is going to mean going and doing something that might be much, much less safe. So there's a lot of mental inertia that drives you to do nothing. So I've always said it's okay to be scared less, but you cannot be scared witless. So no matter how scared you are, the way that you deal with this is to persist in doing the most simple thing that you can think of right now that's going to get you going in the right direction. Sometimes that was as simple as putting on your boots, because putting on your boots is the first thing you've got to do pretty much to get outside. And sometimes it takes 20 minutes to put on your boots. And sometimes it takes 45 minutes to get dressed just to go outside and deal with something. So there's a lot of mental inertia that says, I'm okay here now, I don't need to do this. But in your heart of hearts, you know you've got to do something, because this ain't going to work forever. So these four things: plan, prepare, practice, and persist. This simple feedback loop is the single most powerful metaphor I know for success, no matter how you choose to define success. I simply chose to define it in terms of circumnavigation. Anyone can do this. It's absolutely brain dead simple. It's absolutely bomb-proof, and can be done under the most intense, stressful, and terrifying conditions you can possibly imagine. So if you're planning, that allows you to prepare. If you're prepared, you know what to practice. And if you persist in what you've practiced, you have some idea if it's going to work or not, because you've done it before. And then if it's working, then you know, because it's going to work. It works relative to your plan. And if it's not working, then you know, because it's relative to your plan. So this very, very simple metaphor is incredibly effective. And this simple positive feedback loop is more responsible for me coming back home and being able to complete what I set out to complete than anything else I did, bar none. So here's an example of what I mean by persisting in little tiny wee steps. This is a picture of Suburban heading upwind in about less than 25 knots with seas about 10 or 12 feet. And I sailed upwind in winds anywhere from 5, 6, 7 knots to 40 knots at apparent angles of 60 degrees or higher for more than 6,000 nautical miles. Anyone who's been on a sailboat going upwind knows that's pretty much like sticking needles in your eyes. Anyone who's gone upwind in a sailboat when it's blowing 35, gusting 45, when the waves are 15 to 20 feet, knows it's like sticking needles in both eyes. This is really, really hard, but the only way to do it is to do it at a slow crawl, which is, and if you keep doing it long enough, then you're going to meet up with some measure of success. Well, if persistent pays, then preparation pays huge. In this picture, the significant wave height is 8 meters, which means that 1 in 100 waves is 12 meters, and 1 in 1,000 waves is 15 meters or 49 feet. And from the deck of a small boat, your horizon, let's say you can see 6 miles, which means you're seeing about 113 square miles of ocean in 360 degrees. And I guarantee you, as you look out, you'll see the 50-footers passing by and thinking, oh my God, thank God I'm here. And then you look over the other side of the boat and it's like, oh my God, thank God I'm here. So now is not the time. I can absolutely guarantee you, now is not the time when the waves are cresting and breaking like they are here, and there's 50-footers lurking around. Now is not the time to figure out how to get the storm jib on deck. Now is not the time to figure out how to set it if you do manage to crawl forward and somehow get it on the forestay. Now is not the time to figure out how to get the drogue out of the cockpit locker, because the cockpit is mostly underwater. And as soon as you open the cockpit locker, then you run the risk of flooding the boat. And how do you attach the drogue? How do you launch the drogue without tearing everything in the cockpit apart? I mean, and how do you forget about the difficult things? How do you manage the most basic fundamental skills like steering or reefing or navigating? This is, like I said, this is not the time. And the only time that it makes sense to figure this out is when things are easy. And I mentioned earlier on about making mistakes, and you're going to make plenty of them. There's no doubt about that. You'll make more than you can imagine more than you want to. But one of the things that Carl Jung said, he said that mistakes are, after all, the foundations of truth. The foundations of truth. And if a man does not know what a thing is, it is at least an increase in knowledge if he knows what it is not. So no matter your mistake, it's an opportunity for you to learn something and know something more, and to realize that you can make a better decision. And one of my mottos is to take action early, no matter how small it is. As soon as you think about something, you can think it through, and then you need to do it. And no matter if you're right or wrong, you're going to look like a genius every single time. If you're wrong, even if you're wildly wrong, then you know immediately. And if you've taken action early, that gives you plenty of time to then pursue another course of action that is likely going to be better, because your mistake has led to an increase in an increase in the knowledge base that you need at that time. And if you're right, then you'll know sooner rather than later. And if you know that you're right sooner rather than later, that puts you one step ahead of what's next. And that one step ahead, if you can manage to stay one step ahead of navigating, one step ahead of sail handling, one step ahead of boat handling, one step ahead of whatever anchoring stuff is required, then you are going to be, then your chances of success go up exponentially. So how does this relate then? So I said we're going to talk about what you need to do to actually succeed, I think, and this is plan, prepare, practice, and persist. This navigator's ethos is like I said, is what I believe to be the single most important contributing factor to my ability to succeed in an endeavor where most people haven't. But why celestial navigation? Like I said, it added a layer of difficulty that was beyond imagining. It took me between 2 and 3 hours a day to navigate. And when you're only sleeping 4 hours a day at maximum, 3 hours a day for navigating is a big chunk of time. And in an age of ubiquitous GPS aids, Siri, smartphones, smart devices, and why bother with celestial navigation? Well, I think it's a fundamental, essential skill for anyone who's heading offshore. And I like to practice what I preach. And when I say fundamental, essential skills, I mean that it doesn't come after GPS navigation or inertial navigation. It comes before GPS navigation and inertial navigation. If you go offshore, I guarantee you that every single piece of electronic gear is at one point in time going to fail, which means your chart plotters, this means your GPS antennas, it means your connections. I mean, if I didn't have electrical problems when I was away, then, and everyone's heard this, I shouldn't say heard it, but it's common knowledge, I suppose. If offshore sailors didn't have electrical problems, they wouldn't have problems. So I'm guaranteed that all that stuff is not going to work. But your celestial navigation, the navigation has to work regardless of whether the lights are on or not. And you might think it's some archaic sort of practice that's not done anymore except by hobbyists and people who've got nothing better to do. Well, that isn't the case at all. This is a picture of myself and Nani. Don took this picture. It's while we were running the seamanship course, now the boating 3 course, I believe. We ran plotting exercises on the island, and this is a picture of me with the sextant. One of the sextants I took is a Freiberger, and I was taking at the time practicing taking horizontal sextant angles while the students were doing plotting, taking compass bearings. So it's not an archaic thing at all, any stretch of the imagination. The U.S. Navy just reinstituted learning or teaching celestial navigation, and celestial navigation is on board every single one of their vessels, including nuclear submarines. The U.S. Coast Guard teaches celestial navigation. Of course, the Canadian Navy teaches celestial navigation. When I came back, one of the first lectures I gave was to the navigators course at Fleet School in Esquimalt. The U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command, which you might know as the Strategic Air Command, all their aircraft are primarily navigated using celestial navigation. They use inertial navigation. They don't use GPS. They use inertial navigation. But the celestial navigation confirms that the inertial navigation is working. It doesn't work the other way around. And I was told that by the former base commander of CFB Trenton, who's a navigator and who taught navigation to the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command in the States for years and years and years. Celestial navigation was on board the SR-71, the B-2, the B-52. It was on board all commercial airliners up until around 1985, which I suppose might seem like, hundreds of years ago. But cruise missiles and ICBMs all are navigated and guided using celestial navigation. Now, they don't use what I used, which was this sort of thing. They use robotic sextants that are capable of taking daylight star shots using stars down to magnitude 5. And they do that because the first thing that happens if things were to go south is the navigation or GPS satellites are gone. So it isn't something that's done by hobbyists because they've got nothing better to do. Now, I mentioned that I did it a little bit differently than most people learn celestial navigation, and these are the tools. What's in this picture is everything I needed, other than my wristwatch and some slide rules. I know how to use a slide rule, so and I used the normal, slide rule that you use you can solve mathematical problems on. But I had a very cool slide rule that helped me solve vector problems. So things like apparent wind and true wind and set and drift and those kinds of things. I had a small calculator, or I'm sorry, slide rule that allowed me to do that. Well, in this picture is my Cassins and Plath horizon sextant. It's a full horizon sextant, and if you're thinking of if you're serious about celestial navigation and being accurate with it, then the difference between this and a plastic sextant, because everyone most likely is thinking plastic sextants if they're thinking of doing it because they're relatively inexpensive. The problem with a plastic sextant is that the optics aren't nearly good enough, and certainly where I was, where the horizons and the seas and the bodies, celestial bodies you're trying to shoot are generally obscured, then the optics are the most critical factor if determining if the sextant is actually going to work for you. And what's also in this picture are my tables, the complete set of tables. These are concise S tables. They're my customized worksheet and, of course, the Nautical Almanac. And what do I mean by tables? Because everyone might be used to thinking or seeing 229 or 249. Now, the concise S tables were developed by Mike Pepperday in around 2010. They are extremely compact. They are very easy to use. You plot directly from the DR position. And in my case, they were waterproof. So here's a comparison of the of HO229 and my tables. Now these are the 229. These are the 4 volumes I took on the boat because I took backups to backups and to backups. So, but this isn't a complete set of 229. To navigate at 40 or 60 degrees latitude and higher, so between 60 and 90, you need another 2 books. So this pile would actually be 50% higher, but my tables, which you see there on the right beneath my watch, are a whopping 9 pages. Well, in the original, they're 9 pages, and I reduced that further by eliminating the pages containing directions and examples. And I had them laminated and spiral bound, so they're waterproof. That's the complete set of tables. They allow me to take to use any body. So some tables you're limited to using only select bodies, but this will work for any bodies. And one of the beauties of these tables that you're allowed, the solutions that you produce are exactly like calculated solutions. So I could compare them to a solution I would calculate with a slide rule. So the issue with the large tables is that you can't pin them down on the navigation station. So you have, how is it that you can possibly hold one of those books down while you're trying to use your 2 other hands to draw on the plotting sheet or manipulate some template or whatever the case might be? It's just impossible. So from a practical point of view, using 229 or 249 was just not going to work. To sit and work at the chart table, you're wedged in the chart table using both legs and a hip, and the chart table is all over the place and most likely wet because you're soaking wet. So the way that you would normally teach or use celestial navigation just isn't going to work. I shouldn't say it's not going to work. It wasn't practical where I was. Interestingly, the watch that you see there is a quartz watch by Tissot. It was actually my rated chronograph. I rated this before I left. It was accurate to, well, it lost 3 seconds a month over the course of the trip, over the course of the time that I rated it and over the course of the trip. But this isn't the watch I used every day. This watch was tucked away in a padded box in in hopefully a consistent temperature because quartz watches are notoriously unstable with respect to temperature. But the watch I used every day was just a simple Seiko automatic. And sadly and rather inconveniently, the TISO died, the battery died. And previously, I had replaced the battery once. Batteries last for about 6 years, and I replaced the battery in Victoria, and it was a Chinese battery, and it lasted about 14 months. So sadly, the battery on the watch died, which left me with just my wristwatch. I mentioned that I use customized work forms. These are work forms that I developed myself. They are specific for the S tables that I used. They're color coded, which means that I know what data to put in what column, no matter how tired I am, because you're going to make the simplest mistakes possible. And what's interesting about these tables, beyond the color coding and the customization for the S tables themselves, is that there's 8 columns. And why 8 columns? Why did I think it was important to have 8 columns? Well, navigators know that it's more accurate to take a number of sites of a single body than it is to take a bunch of sites of a bunch of bodies. So if you take multiple sites of a single body, that allows you to average the intercepts or the altitudes. They're equivalent, and if you average them, then you get a better answer. So in the Southern Ocean, it is impossible in general to get multi-body fixes. It's either the horizon is obscured because the swell is running at 15 feet and your height of eye is 8, or the body is just not going to be visible because of it's behind a sail, or it's behind the steering vane or something, or it's just hidden in a cloud. So anytime that you get an opportunity to get a site, then the site has to be as accurately as you can possibly, yes, it has to be as accurate as humanly possible, because that might be the only site you get for the next 3 or 4 or 5 days. The longest I went between celestial observations was close to 12 days. So you're dead reckoning over the course of those 12 days. And when you do get a site, it has to be as good as it possibly can, because that might be the only one you get for another 12 days. And I didn't average sites because that's not as accurate. Sorry, that's not as accurate as calculating. Sorry, let's see if I have some water. That's better. Sorry about that. That's not as accurate as calculating what the rate of change of altitude is going to be. Sorry. That better work, because that's all the water I have left.
Take a second.
Averaging sites is not as accurate as calculating what the rate of change of altitude is. So on this little slide, you see what the calculated rate of change of altitude is and how that compares to the sites. These are actual sites. So that's what you might think the average is. And you might think that, oh, well, my first site is good and I can use that one. But it turns out that the first site is bad and the next 3 are good. So whenever I could, I calculated the rate of change of altitude, and that allowed me to very quickly determine what site was going to be good and what site was going to be bad. And it's also convenient for plotting because any point on that line is representative of that set of sites. Now, I know from experience that your plotting errors are going to be far greater than your DR errors, and your DR errors are going to be far greater than your site errors. So I was absolutely meticulous about my plotting, and I used standardized plotting sheets, nothing strange about them. I used the nomenclature and charting conventions that are taught by CPS. They're the same as they are. What's taught is what is standardized around the world, and I used standardized symbology. But I used, to make everything nice and neat, I had a very nice little template that drafters use to make nice, neat circles. So it's very easy when you're extremely tired to make massive errors in plotting. It's just all you have to do is label a few things wrong, and pretty soon you're 100 miles away from where you should be. So I was very meticulous about plotting, and because I know that plotting errors are sometimes greater than DR errors, and I was very, very meticulous about my DR record. I had a separate navigator's log, which was a small handheld waterproof notebook and pencil that was with me in my pocket everywhere I went. So anytime that there was a course change, a wind change, a sail change, anytime that there was a speed change, I wrote it down on the navigator's log, and that's what got translated into the ship's log, and that's what allowed me to be very, very meticulous about my DR. So my DR errors were in the range of about 5%, 10% if things were really bad. So over the course of 100 miles, if I was between, I never expected my DR errors to be greater than 10 miles, and that is pretty darn good, especially considering that, for example, especially considering the conditions I was doing it in. And I went from Cape Lewin to just about around New Zealand using pretty much nothing but DR, because it was storm after storm after storm after storm. And what's interesting about this particular plotting sheet, and this is, I guess, isn't really representative, but what's interesting about this is that I was at the Tropic of Cancer at noon at the same time the sun was at the Tropic of Cancer. And as much fun as I was having plotting this, I made a mistake in the plotting sheet. As an example, your plotting errors are going to be greater than your DR errors, blah, blah, blah. I drew in the Tropic of Cancer ever so carefully at the wrong latitude. It's not at 23, it should be at 23, 26 and change. So as excited as I was and as meticulous as I wanted to be, I actually made a mistake on this plotting sheet. So like I said, your plotting errors are going to be greater than your DR errors, which are going to be greater than your site errors. So I was, coupled with some reasonable navigation and coupled with the 4 Ps of what I've termed the navigator's ethos: plan, prepare, practice, and persist, I ended up some 265 days after I've left back in Victoria. This is a picture of Suburban taken by Don from Sachs Point. It's probably the first visual sighting of the boat that my family had since I had left some 265 days ago. And even though this is the first time in just about 265 days that I was actually a little bit relaxed, because when you're looking southwest towards Race Rocks and Bentinck Island, and I sailed through, I'd been up for 3 days straight trying to get through the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and I spent the previous night sailing backwards underneath the asymmetrical, trying to get around Race Rocks, because that's a tidal gate, in time to make the July 18th welcoming party. So, and I was dodging, there was probably 40, that morning there was probably close to 40 recreational fishing boats fishing in where I was trying to sail, and there was of course the commercial traffic, which is just pouring around Race Rocks. So sailing through Juan de Fuca Strait was nerve-wracking, even though I wasn't so much worried about wind and wave, I was worried about getting run over. So this picture is probably a good example of the first time I was able to celebrate. And this is a picture of the boat, again by Don, just off Sachs Point. It's the welcoming party. That's my son Alex swimming out to meet me. And one of the goals I set out for myself was to come back with the boat in nearly the same, or as close to the same shape as possible. And Suburban here looks pretty good, other than some beat up varnish and the boot stripe. The boot stripe I painted over with white anti-fouling paint to keep the gooseneck barnacles from growing on the hull. So the boot stripe looks a bit ratty, but other than that, the boat looks pretty good. And the only trouble I had really beyond some routine maintenance was I broke the halyard. I had actually had spare halyards on board, and all the things I didn't think that were going to break on the running rigging, it was a 3/16 piece of 7 by 19 stainless wire that was part of the halyard for the forward jib. The forward jib is the strongest, most powerful sail on the boat, and the loss of the forward jib just a little bit east of New Zealand cost me 2 weeks. So I was 2 weeks slower coming back through the Pacific because the only jib I had was a 70% jib, the jib that's behind my shoulder. So the only major failure I suffered was the loss of the forward jib because of the broken halyard. This is the same day, July 18th. It's me coming into Victoria Harbour, and that's the customs dock in the foreground. And this is, again, taken by Don. This is a picture of me walking back to turn off the engine, and the circumnavigation is officially complete and officially I'm officially no longer underway because I'm tied up to the dock. So officially, legally, I'm no longer underway and things are done and finished. Well, that was July 18th, but I actually got back to Gabriola about 12 or so days later on August 1st. That's my wife, Nani, and that's taken at Silva Bay. And what you see just underneath Nani's elbow is some of the welcoming committee. So I had a beautiful, warm welcome from all COVID safe from the Silva Bay Yacht Club and the Power Squadron and some other friends of mine and family. And when I arrived, I was greeted by the Chief Commander, Peter Bolton, and I was given a citation for commemorating my successful circumnavigation. I was extremely honored and extremely proud to have been presented this personally by the commander. And about this time, it sort of began to sink in that I had actually done it. But you don't do things in a vacuum, and you never do things alone. And this is a shot of the suburban shore team. And on my right-hand side is my sister Leah, who is the manager. And the shore team, there was no such thing when I left. It sort of came together when I was gone. And thank God for that, because they were one of the reasons that I was able to get around and come back sane, and certainly one of the reasons I was able to get around and come back safely. So on my right is my sister. On my left, of course, is Nani. She's holding the Chief Commander's commendation for the work that the shore team had done in ensuring that I came back in one piece. On Nani's left, you'll recognize Dawn, and on Dawn's, and Dawn spent countless hours documenting the trip for the blog and for social media by sending what I had written or posting what I had written on the blog. And on Dawn's left is John Bullis. John Bullis was the meteorological and weather rocket scientist who kept me from driving into hurricanes and storms. My weather window was only about 3 days. That's as much as I could. That's as far ahead as I could look, given the constraints of how I was able to get weather. But John's job was to make sure to have a much broader, more macro perspective of the weather, and to make sure that I wasn't doing anything completely stupid in spite of myself. And on John's left of is his wife Sally, who put up with John's absence while he was poring over weather, trying to make sure that I wasn't being any sillier than I already am. So without the shore team, my experiences would have been dramatically different and not nearly as positive as they were. And lastly, this is a picture of Dawn and myself, and what we're holding is the Gabriola Power Squadron Burgee that flew under each of the 5 capes, and it's appropriately tattered up because it has seen some serious abuse. And Dawn's holding a small note that commemorates that and describes what that is. And our intention is to award that to the Power Squadron so that it can hang somewhere national and commemorate what I've done and the support that I received from the Power Squadron in accomplishing what I did. So in conclusion then, I want to say a very deep and heartfelt thank you to the Chief Commander, Peter Bolton, for the invite to speak with so many of my colleagues today. And again, I want to thank Don, Bud, and John for doing just a fantastic job. Again, not in communicating what I had done and then keeping me safe. So, and of course, thank you to each and every one of you for taking the time to sit and listen through the presentation. And I'm more than happy to entertain questions, of course, and I encourage anyone who has an interest to reach out and talk to me. I'd be happy to do that. So thank you very much, and questions, I hope.
I can't see any. Can you see, John?
I can't see a question. If you can hear me.
If anyone has questions, you should be able to see there's a little tab. It looks like a square with a question mark on it. Right at the bottom or at the top right, depending on the screen you have. So feel free to post your questions there. I'll make an announcement. You should see a small bubble pop up.
Yeah, but I should be on the live event Q&A, shouldn't we?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, while we're waiting, if maybe I could ask a quick question, if I could. One of the things that we're taught was to keep a sharp lookout How did you feel about keeping a sharp lookout when these waves are enveloping you? You're miles away from everyone, but that freighter that is on about ready to collide with you is over that next wave. How do you feel about your keeping a sharp watch?
Well, there's a couple of ways to look at it, but fundamentally, to begin with, the amount of traffic, vessel traffic in those areas is absolutely none, I think zero. On the way down from basically from San Francisco to Cape Horn, I saw 2 ships, one very far away, and one that I saw that I was only able to sort of talk to on the radio. Then I saw a few ships going around, leaving the Falklands, and then the next traffic I saw was north of Hawaii coming back. So the amount of vessel traffic is very low. I did run into the industrialized commercial fishing fleet, and that's a danger because one of the ways that I maintained a watch was with an AIS alarm. So I had a system on board that was broadcasting my position on AIS all the time, and I had an automated alarm set up so that if I was going to be to run afoul of anyone, then or they of me, then I would know. So what is, it's impossible to keep a watch all the time because you have to go to sleep. So the question is, what happens then? Well, when there is no risk of collision, if you read the coal regs carefully, there's an interpretation that you can apply to the coal regs that means in the event that there is no risk of collision, there's no requirement to maintain a watch. That's debatable. So certainly in the Southern Ocean, there is no risk of collision because there's nobody around literally for thousands of miles. So the requirement to maintain watch, to look for other ships is minimized in the extreme. But where there are ships, I knew it. So for example, you can use the celestial navigation technique that I was using to determine where the great circle routes are between major ports, say Yokohama and San Francisco, or the Far East and Vancouver, or say Cape Horn and New Zealand, whatever the case might be. You can figure out what the Great Circle route is, and then you know that when you're approaching it. So then your watch keeping has to change because there's certainly, all the commercial traffic is confined to, I shouldn't say confined, but is generally around the Great Circle routes. So, but having said that, everyone feels that the onus is on the small vessel navigator to maintain a watch, which it is, but that doesn't mean that the onus isn't any less, that there isn't any less requirement for the large vessel to maintain a watch. And I can tell you from experience, whether it's sailing around the world or sailing into the Gulf of Alaska or on the off the West Coast or in the Bering Sea, that the watch keeping standards aboard commercial vessels and in particular fishing vessels is absolutely and completely abysmal. The vessels, most of the commercial traffic I saw was coming back from Hawaii towards the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and I would say less than 25% will actually answer you on the radio, even though they're supposed to be maintaining a watch on 16. They won't answer you on shortwave. They won't answer you if you flash Morse at them. They won't. They just ignore you completely. Either they're not watching or they don't care. Or worse yet, they feel that if they miss you by a half a mile, that may as well be 5. And there's nothing worse than seeing a freighter come out of the fog at you, and you call them on the radio, and they say, "Oh, that's fine. We're going to pass within, a couple of cables. It's okay." So that's all great, and that works perfectly if everything works perfectly. But of course, on a sailboat, nothing works perfectly. So that's all fine and good if they decide to pass you at half a mile until the jib's backwinds or the halyard breaks or you rip a sail or the self-steering gear fails. So in a perfect world, missing by half a mile is fine, but that's what happens. So the watch keeping standards on board commercial and like I said, fishing vessels is really, really, really low. Which doesn't mean that you shouldn't be keeping watch. It means that you have to be even that much more careful. But there's like I said, the shortcuts both ways. But when I was near shipping lanes, then I was up all the time, keeping a watch to make sure that, firstly, I wasn't running into fishing vessels because they're, especially the industrialized fleet, they're really dangerous because they turn AIS off. Actually, they don't want anyone to find out where they are. 80% of all commercial fish catch is illegal, and They don't want anyone to know where they are. So I would go through, on 2 separate occasions, I went through squid fishing fleet. They fish with giant lights. You can't miss them, but it's usually a flotilla of vessels, and you only see one, and everyone else is unlit with the AIS off. So yeah, it's an interesting issue, but
we got a whole bunch of questions here, Bert. If you want to,
sure.
Big bravo from Patrick Gagnier from Estuar. Bravo, very good, and on it goes. And I can answer the next one from Anonymous. Gabriel is the home base. Yes, it is. And what a couple of interesting ones here from Mary Page. Is there anything that you feel has changed within you, or how you approach your life?
Well, I talked about it. I talked about these the 4 Ps, and one of the things I can tell you is that I was certainly afraid, and I was certainly beset at some points by what I'd refer to, or what economists would refer to, and what I talked about in terms of anxiety or activity inertia, is that you're basically in the boat. The boat is being absolutely hammered, and I mean hammered. And it's extreme. You know that the weather is going to get worse, but what you're doing right now is working because you're still alive. The boat is still floating. You're going in the direction you want. You know, the boat isn't out of control in terms of speed, and the rig isn't going to come down because, you know, you've got too much sail up. But so it's what's working now, but you know the weather's going to get worse. So I would sit there and think, okay, what have I got to do right now? Because you're thinking, okay, in 12 hours the weather's going to be worse. But 12 hours from now is an eternity. That isn't going to work. So what you can do right now, though, is look outside to get some idea of what the wave state is going to be before it gets dark, so you can make a better decision. So how do you get outside? Because it takes you an hour to get dressed. You got to eat, and you got to sleep, and you got to navigate. So what do you do? So I would say, okay, what do I got to do right now that's going to get me outside? I said, well, I got to get somehow to the head, because in the head I could lodge myself between the doorway and then allow myself 2 feet to get my boots on. I said, I can get to the head and I can lodge myself in the doorway. And if I can get there, then maybe I can get my boots on. And if I can get my boots on, then maybe I can get my foul weather gear on. And then maybe if I get my foul weather gear on, I can stand beneath the companionway hatch and time the waves to get outside, because you don't just throw open the hatch and jump outside. You got to actually look out there and figure, okay, between wave sets, because the cockpit is underwater and waves are sweeping the boat, how do I get outside without flooding the cabin? And how do I get outside without being washed off the boat in the time it takes to get clipped on or clipped off, whatever the case might be. But I would start down this path of little tiny steps. And like, for example, again, climbing Mount Everest is a really simple thing. It's just a walk. Sometimes it's a scramble, but you're attached to a rope all the time. There's no real danger of falling. It's very, very cold, but it's a walk. It just so happens that every single step is excruciatingly painful, but it's just a walk. But if you can take one step, then maybe you can take another one. So that was my modality. And when I got back, I realized that's applicable to everything that you can imagine. So I took that away. And then, of course, on a more introspective level, you have lots of time to think, and because you're so very close to nature, and you're so very close to what I would call the grandness of creation, you cannot help but think about those things that are greater than you. And if you are, then you're in essence brain dead doing that sort of thing. So it was a tremendous opportunity to get to experience nature firsthand, and with that opportunity you get a real opportunity to think very deeply and experience very deeply those things that are much greater than you. So those are 2 things: an introspective / sort of personal thing, and then something maybe a little more practical.
Here's one from Tony Gardner.
Don,
yes.
Sorry, John. Can I ask a very quick question?
Sure.
Could you tell us about the psychological side of it, the psychological battle? Tell them the story about when you hurt your arm, and a young boy sent you an email. It's a really touching story.
Well, I was followed by some close to more than 7,000 people on social media. Every single day there'd be 7,000 people reading what Don had put up on the blog. It was incredible. It's something I hadn't intended to do. one of the things that I intended to do was inspire other people to pursue their dreams, no matter how crazy and nutty they might seem, big or small. And I figured if I could do something extremely hard, then there would be no excuse for anybody else. They would say, well, I would do that, except, what you did wasn't so hard, because, well, that doesn't apply, because what I did was beyond hard. But I had set out to inspire people, and what I hadn't realized, was that the people that were following me were far more inspirational than I think I was. So I was being followed by young children, and by people of all ages and from all over the world, all nationalities, you name it. And they were the short snippets that I would see and that would get back to me were incredibly uplifting, especially when things were really, really, really tough. You got to find motivation somewhere, and I had thought that I would be able to dig deep enough to find that within myself, and perhaps I could have, but I was uplifted in ways that I couldn't possibly imagine by people who were following me. In this one instance, I mentioned today that you should do everything in your power not to get injured, because injury is the worst thing that can happen. And while I was sailing in the Southern Indian Ocean, I was thrown back against the pedestal guard on the compass, and it was the result of a moment's inattention. I had released both hands and was looking over my shoulder at a wave that was coming, and in that instance I was just hurled into the pedestal compass, and I was bent over backward, and I hurt my back, and I ended up being strapped down to my bunk for close to 2 days, unable to move, barely able to sail the boat, unable to eat, unable to do just about anything except the bare minimum of sailing. And that was because, and I was only able to do that because the conditions were very mild, or relatively mild. And during that time, I received an email from a teacher who had 400 students that were following the trip. And every day she would read the blog, and they would post on a big map of the world what I was, where I was, and they would study the ocean currents, and they would study whatever the weather was like there, and whatever history was nearby. So it was really, it was quite a fun thing for them, I think, and they had really grown to like it. And when I passed under Cape Agulhas, one of these 7 or 8 year old kids jumped up spontaneously and said, "Carry on, Mr. terHart." And the teacher was incredibly touched by that, and she relayed that to me. And she didn't know that "carry on, Mr. terHart" that's how you refer to in military college. You're a mister, you're not an officer or a sir, you're just a mister. And when you're dismissed, the word is, "carry on." So as I was lying there in my bunk, I literally unable to move, I got this message, and I was just about moved to tears, because I figured that there's no way in the world that I could disappoint this one little guy. If I needed motivation to get back, then that's all the motivation I would need, because there was nothing in the world that I could imagine that I couldn't get over, because there's no way in the world I wanted to disappoint this little guy who had jumped up and belted out, "Carry on, Mr. terHart." So the amount of motivation and inspiration I got from people who were following was more uplifting than I can possibly give words to. It was incredible, and one of the highlights of the trip.
Thanks very much, Don.
Doreen and Dave asked something about food. How do you prepare your food? Did you fish? Did you lose weight? Did you have dehydrated food? Those things.
Firstly, I have no saltwater fishing mojo at all, so I can't catch anything if it swims in the ocean. So I tried fishing, but within the first 5 minutes, I brought 2 lures, and within the first 5 minutes, I lost the first one. It was just ripped off the boat. So I figured I'd save the next one till I got back into the Pacific. And then I fished for thousands of miles. I dragged this thing behind the boat, far, near, weighted, unweighted. I dragged this thing for thousands of miles, literally from New Zealand to Hawaii. And my dad says I have the record for the longest unsuccessful fishing trip in the world. So I tried. But the open ocean is a desert. There's actually nothing there. It's one of the reasons why the water is so clear. It's only very large marine mammals and a few pelagic fishes. So I don't have any. Although I tried, I didn't catch anything. And I prepared. I didn't. One of the things that I grossly one of my biggest mistakes was I grossly underestimated how hungry I was going to be. I know that Volvo Ocean Cruise, they eat about 6,000 calories per person per day, but I figured that, well, I won't be sailing in nearly quite as hard as they would be, and quite as in environments that are quite as extreme, because I was trying to stay above 47 south. So, and they're sailing typically around 48 and 50. So I figured, well, the conditions are going to be a little bit milder. So I didn't think I'd be eating 6,000 calories a day. So I planned for about 2,500 calories a day. As it turns out, I was eating down south about 6,000 calories a day. So I very quickly realized I was going to run out of food. So one of the mistakes, I planned very carefully. I knew exactly what I was going to eat every single day of the week. I knew what I was going to have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day. And I knew what my servings were going to be. And I put on board enough food for basically 9 months, which I figured I never thought I would take 265 days. I thought I would be about between 200 and 205. But I was becalmed for more than 50 days. So that means that you're not going anywhere. You're stuck. You're drifting, and that is 50 days translates to about 6,000 miles, which is pretty much the whole breadth of the Pacific. And even though you're becalmed, the motion on the boat is still extreme, and you're still worried about things breaking, about the rig coming off, about shock loading the rig all the time, and the running rigging is the worst thing you can do to it. And of course, you're going through water and food. So being becalmed for as long as I did had a real impact. Losing the jib had another, impact. So I was definitely short on food, but I knew what I was going to eat every single day. I eat, as people here know me, I'm pretty simple when it comes to food. So that part was pretty easy, but I didn't buy enough because I underestimated my appetite because of the cold and the workload. And in terms of dehydrated food, I had very little dehydrated food because that means you need water. And water, it's not so much food that's an issue, but water is an issue. So I took 120 US gallons of water, so just about 440 liters of water, which meant that I could have 2 liters a day for about 220 days, which is what I figured. I knew I would have to catch rainwater, but figured if I really, really had to, then I could get by with the water I had on board, because there's no guarantee you're going to catch rainwater. It's likely, but there's no guarantee. And I don't have a water maker because I just would have ended up fixing it. So dehydrated food means you need water. You need a lot of water, actually. So dehydrated food, I took virtually none of it. I didn't use it.
Tony Gardner asked a couple of questions here. What was your worst moment, and did you ever have occasion to use Morse code?
Really good questions. Yes, I did have an occasion to use Morse code. Actually, so I'll answer that one first. When I came through Race Rocks, one of the persons following me, a Canadian, said that there's a camera on Race Rocks that you can manipulate, a user can manipulate. So he wanted to get a shot of me sailing through Race Rocks. And I said, okay, I'll sail as close as I can to Race Rocks, conditions allowing. That will be my job. Your job will be to decipher the signal I send you. So if I go through in daylight, then look on the port spreaders, there'll be a flag signal. And if I go through any other time, I'll Morse you the signal. So I sent him Bravo Zulu in Morse. And of course, on the starboard spreaders, it was Bravo Zulu. So Bravo Zulu is da dot 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 da da dot dot. So yeah, that's what I did. So I had on occasion to use Morse code, and the lowest point is being becalmed by far and away. You might think the storms, but of course, I shouldn't say of course, but in terms of the storms, when things get really, 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 really bad, then you're doing everything you can. There's always something you can do. Like I said, there's always absolutely something you can do to improve the odds. And I don't care what that is. Sometimes that means pumping the bilge. Like, is the bilge full of water? And if you know that the bilge is dry, no matter how terrible the weather is, you're improving your odds. So it doesn't matter. There's always something you can do. So you're always trying to move forward, no matter how it is. But when there's no wind, when the boat is just sitting there, and it's not flat, like the ocean is never flat. You're getting hammered. The motion of the boat when there's no wind is chaotic. And of course, the rig is being shock loaded as the boat is being rolled from side to side. In the Clipper days, the captains would have the royals and the topmast lowered because you could roll the mast right out of the boat in the doldrums. And that they did it as a matter of course because that's what would happen. So if you're becalmed in the Southern Ocean, then of course there's still giant waves around. Just because there's no wind doesn't mean there's no waves, and the motion is horrible. Like, it's absolutely brutal. And firstly, you're chewing through all your food, chewing through all your water. There's nothing you can do. You can barely do maintenance. You can barely sit down and write. I mean, to sleep. I slept strapped down into a bunk with a seatbelt hauled as hard as you possibly could against, so that I wouldn't be thrown out of bed. And when I mean thrown out of bed, I flew out of the bunk 5 times. As I woke up airborne 5 separate times when I was away, which is an unpleasant sort of experience. You know, you wake up flying, literally. So, and you end up getting hurt if you land. So, and when you're becalmed, the emotion is just absolutely insane. When you're sailing, and even if there's a storm, typically on a storm you're going downwind. You're going downwind as fast as you possibly can dare. So the motion is at least somewhat stabilized. And of course, they're bad. I mean, I was knocked down twice really badly, and of course in a storm, which meant that I stuck the mast in the water at 90 degrees or greater twice. So, but even then the boat is actually a little bit stable. Anyway, so yeah, the worst time is being becalmed.
Anyway, Patrick Gagne from Estuar, Saint Laurent asks again, did you see some evidence of pollution areas? And as we see sometimes in the environmentalist reports, yesterday we had a great presentation on pollution and or anti-pollution, I suppose, but wondered if you had seen any on the way, any evidence of pollution.
Well, one of the citizen scientist experiments that I was involved with 3, was cataloging macroplastics, which was basically looking for a debris floating in the ocean. And I saw 12 pieces of plastic when I was sailing around the world. So you might think that isn't very much, but I'm looking at a swath of ocean that is actually pretty small. So if you multiply my tiny little swath of the ocean and figure out what that means in terms of the entire breadth of the ocean, then my 12 pieces of plastic actually blows up pretty darn quickly. So the plastics in the ocean are a very serious problem, and certainly microplastics are an enormous problem. Of course, you can't see microplastics, so you have to do plankton trawls. And I was scheduled to do plankton trawls, but I couldn't actually get and deal with the trawl. So to answer your question more specifically, yes, I saw evidence of it, because you see plastics floating in the ocean, even if you're just looking around. And although, I mean, bear in mind that I'm sailing in places where there's nothing. Like, I mean, the Southern Ocean it's this vast, inhospitable desert. It's more remote than. It's almost more remote than Mars in terms of what we know about it, in terms of the human footprint there. But in places where I saw like three pieces of plastic between San Francisco, or basically Victoria, and all the way around the world to Hawaii, and then all the remainder of the plastic I saw coming back from Hawaii. So there's a couple of reasons for that. One, you're getting closer to what you may have seen as these giant floating islands of garbage. That I never saw. I don't know anyone who's ever seen one of these giant floating, seas of garbage. I think those are, I'll say they're mythological. However they've come to be as myth. I did sail through. I did sail close to Henderson Island, which is the most polluted beach in the world in terms of plastic. The amount of plastic there's just tons and tons of it. So in those places, and Henderson Island is very close to the the equivalent of the North Pacific High in the South Pacific. It's a subtropical high, which of course is there's very few currents, or the currents tend to flow there, and then the currents tend to die in that particular area. So it congregates plastic. On other trips up to Alaska and other places, I've seen on shore especially, there's just an incredible there's an incredible degree of plastic pollution, and almost all of it is from fish boats. Every piece of plastic I saw, I shouldn't say that the 2 times going through the Pacific on the way south that I saw plastic, it was right after I passed a fish boat. So I think most of the plastics that you see, and most of the plastic in the ocean is there by the international fishing fleet. There is an enormous, the amount of commercial fishing traffic in the ocean would be, if you looked at the numbers, you'd be staggered, I think. So yeah, I didn't see evidence, but it's not quite. Whenever you see these Texas, you hear these Texas-sized floating islands of garbage you can walk across in the Pacific. That's just that's myth.
How did you communicate with your support group? Can you give us an idea?
That's a really good question, and I was incredibly fortunate when I left to receive a small grant from the Ocean Cruising Club, and that grant allowed me to buy an Iridium Go. So what I had on board for communication was I had a shortwave radio, a single sideband. Before I left, I made sure I wrote the ham exam. I got a very good mark, actually, Don. I have to keep ahead of Bob Dirksen all the time. So if Bob's listening, I got a good mark. So before I left, I wrote the ham exam so that I could use ham radio. And I've used SailMail before, which doesn't require a ham license, but to get full worldwide coverage using a single sideband, then you need a ham license. And the single sideband radio is still by far and away the cheapest, the best, the easiest to use. And beyond the ham radio, I was lucky enough to get an Iridium Go. And Iridium Go allowed me to download weather data, so grid data, directly onto a computer. So I downloaded the grid data onto a computer, which allowed me to then have some idea what was coming and some idea of what my route was. But what also the Iridium allowed me to do was to receive text messages, unlimited text messages from the support team at home, and to send emails back home. The single sideband, you can send email, but you can only send email to another licensed ham operator. The third-party rules are very strictly enforced and becoming more so, especially in the United States. So you're not allowed to send email to somebody other than a licensed ham operator. So that's limited. So I was able to send emails back home, and I was able to send low-resolution pictures back. I couldn't receive pictures, but I could send pictures. And to send a picture, here's an example. It would take about 20 to 30 minutes to send one picture back, because you couldn't send it in one fell swoop. It would take usually 4 tries to send the picture. So I would take some pictures. I would try to get the best one, sort through them. Then I would take half an hour at least to send the picture, and then of course I would have to write something. So there was a tremendous effort. I shouldn't say that sounds, no, I spent a good deal of effort taking pictures and then sending them back, so that primarily, and I started out just so that my father and my family could keep track of what was going on. And when Don took it upon himself, along with Bob Dirksen, who I've not mentioned here, other than to say, I got to make sure I get at least as good as mark as Bob, because he's an incredibly intelligent and accomplished man. So who got a higher mark than me in the seamanship course, I have to say. So anyway, between Bob and Bob Dirksen and Don Butt, they managed to get what I'd written onto the blog. And of course, it went. My sister, in terms of the shore team, she had taken what I was reading, taken what I wrote and the pictures and put them on Facebook. So Don was responsible for the blog primarily, and then my sister was looking after Facebook and some other social media stuff. So if it hadn't been for the Iridium Go, there'd be no pictures. There'd be virtually no blog. So I was very lucky to get that. But that was my communication strategy: was a single sideband and then this Iridium Go.
Someone asks, did you ever have seasickness? And second question, that is sort of part of the title, was there a point you thought of turning or canceling your circumnavigation?
Well, I think that's a really good question, actually. Well, let me answer the first one first. First, no, I never got seasick once. I'm not prone to seasickness, which isn't to say that I've never been seasick. I've been seasick before on more than one occasion, that's for sure. But part of my I had any number of checklists. I haven't mentioned them in this at all, but I had checklists for everything. So if the weather was going to blow above 35, I had a checklist for heavy weather. If it's going to blow above 45, I had a checklist for severe weather. So I had checklists for everything, which was one of those things that helped get me on the path. And on my heavy weather checklist, I have seasickness medication, because you simply cannot afford to be debilitated with seasickness. And if you get it really badly, then you just can't function anymore. And I've been on board boats, big and small, with people who have been unfortunately stricken with seasickness. And it's like being hit over the head with a hammer if you've never had it or never seen anybody have it. You are every bit as likely to throw yourself over the side of the boat as you are to go down below and go to sleep. And I know that on certain cruises, on bigger boats, the size of the Vector or size of the Perzo, these DFO research vessels, that we've had to confine people to their cabin, because otherwise they might end up doing something. They're so seasick, they've been that way for so long, that they'll do something completely and totally irrational. So even though I would check if the seasickness medication I always have is meclizine. It's an antihistamine, and it's non-drowsy, number one, and secondly, it's the most effective one I know of. So I use meclizine, but it's on my heavy weather checklist. Although on very, I think I took seasickness medication maybe once or twice actually, and both times it was because the motion was just horrible, and I was down below having to sit there and stare at the slide rule and stare at the plotting sheet and stare at the tables and everything else like that, and then write up the log as well. So I would start to feel just a little bit sideways, and I knew that if I got on it, if you're going to do something, do it now. So I would, as soon as I felt like that, I did it. So because I have been seasick in the past, but on this trip, I was never seasick. And what was this? What was the second part of that question, Don? I forgot that, the interesting one.
Yeah. Did you ever feel like turning back?
Yes. Did I ever feel like turning? No, never. Maybe that's the Army training in me, but never ever did I entertain the thought of quitting. As soon as I left the dock, the only thing that I figured would be a success would be if I came back to the dock. Everything. So I never got to the point, well, if I get here, I'll quit, or if I get there, I'll quit. Never, ever once did I have it in my mind that I was going to stop.
Yeah.
Never. Even if I was injured really badly, and I had some other things that didn't go so well, like my right leg being twice the size of my left leg, that sort of thing. But never, I wasn't gonna. So it never entered my mind. I've done that I used to run. When I was in college, I used to run cross country. So I never began a race thinking that I'm going to stop. So that's just not part of what keeps me ticking. And I think that if you leave thinking that you're going to stop, then you will. I mean, you've already made plans to stop. You're in your mind, you're already planning to stop. So I never in my mind was I planning to stop.
And I guess you get to a point where closer is straight ahead rather than behind you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's my sister was pretty happy when I got to the other side of the world, because every mile now was a mile closer as opposed to a mile farther away.
And I do remember what your knee looked like when you came back. Okay. Anyway, did you ever use an artificial horizon? Robert Craig asked the question.
I've used an artificial horizon, but only as practice. But it is impossible to use on a small boat, because the platform has to be still, absolutely still. So it's it can't be used. And when it's still enough to use an artificial horizon, then of course the horizon is probably decent. So no, I never used an artificial horizon. I imagine at some point at night when it's completely and totally flat, calm, and it's the middle of the night, maybe you might be able to use it to see a star or something like that. But the field of view is so small, and it's really, really tough to do. I've used them on land, however. So I think they're a tremendous tool in terms of practice and just, honing your skills, certainly taking sighting skills or sight taking skills. But at sea, it's a pretty tough thing to do.
Here's one from Mary Abbott, or Mary Page Abbott of USPS AB Club. What is your SSB call?
Oh, it's Victor Alpha 7 Bravo Tango Hotel.
Say it again.
It's Victor Alpha 7 Bravo Tango Hotel. VA7 BTH.
Got it. I hope your pencil didn't break.
No, what's interesting is that the single sideband packed it up, going south. So off the coast, off of Baja California, the single sideband would send but would no longer receive. So,
go ahead.
Which is a big deal. Which is a very big deal, actually. So that was not a good thing when that happened.
Patrick Gagne and another one, Karen, asked a couple of questions that are kind of related. What did you miss the most on the trip? And Karen says, outside of home, what was the most beautiful sight?
Here's what I missed the most. And it's going to sound crazy, but I missed putting something down and then finding it in the same place 5 seconds later. It gets incredibly tedious and annoying to put a pencil down and then reach for it 5 seconds later and it's on the other side of the boat. And I don't care what you put down, whether it's a pencil or your spoon or your plate of spaghetti or whatever the case might be, it's gone in the next 5 seconds. So one of the things I missed the most was actually just setting something down in front of me and then picking it up a few seconds later. And the most beautiful sight is dawn or dusk. Like the nights are literally beyond description. They are it's not often that the stars are really clear because it's often hazy, especially when you're so close to when you're at sea level. But the stars are to die for. It is absolutely exquisite and astounding to see the universe unfold every single night. And the sunsets and the sunrises, there's just you. So you look out, you get on deck, you look out over at a sunset and you just are humbled and completely and totally in awe of the incredible beauty that's on display just for you. Like the entire universe is there just for you. And it is something that is, like I said, is incredibly humbling and it is something that it's almost impossible to experience on land. You'd have to you have to be the only person on a mountaintop, for example, to experience that, to experience that sort of thing. So the most beautiful thing by far and away were the evenings. They're simply exquisite and figuratively they're something to die for.
One question from Anonymous here. Was it difficult to walk on land when you finally stepped off the boat?
Yes.
There's a syndrome. There's a medical name for a syndrome for that.
Yes.
Disembarkation syndrome.
You walk around. You walk around as if the next place you put your foot is not going to be there anymore. So you walk with this very specific, awkward waddle, thinking that at any waking moment the land is going to be somewhere else. So, and it took about 6 weeks for that to actually go away. And so yeah, it's there. And some people, when they get off a small boat, especially, are actually land sick. It's so disorienting that they experience what some people experience, or what most people experience when they go to sea, as in seasickness. So yes, land sickness is very real. It's very awkward. You look very silly. My namesake, actually, my middle name is Adrian, and my uncle, my father's family were sailors. His father's family were sailors. So I'm named after one of my uncles, Adrian, who was a sailor, and they could tell that he had been at sea by the way he walked. So he had a very, very, very particular waddle, and they would pick him out in a massive crowd. Oh, Uncle Adrian's back from sea, back home. So yeah, it's very real. And I suffered for, like I said, about more than 6 weeks with it.
One question here. How are we doing for time, by the way? Do we have another?
Well, we way overrun.
Sorry.
Are there any really good questions to finish? Because we really need to. We have a board meeting in 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. One quick last question then. Did you lose that tooth during your journey?
Yeah, you've got C. Billy Bert. Yeah, I did. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. I lost it because I got smacked across the face with a hockey stick, and the tooth was there, but then I bashed it out when I put my mouth, when my mouth and the pulpit on the boat, I tried to occupy the same physical space at the same time, so it got banged out on board.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of comments congratulating you on an incredible journey here. Wouldn't want to begin to go through them all, but maybe we can summarize them after. Bert, what a fantastic inspiration this has been. You've given us some pointers not only for being on the boat successfully and getting back to shore, but also as guidelines in our own lives. Thank you so much.
It's been
thanks very much. I just add to Don's comments. Thanks very much indeed for a great presentation. I like the Army 4 Ps. It's a really good guide in life as well as planning for such a journey as this. Go ahead, Bert.
Well, I'd like to say again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and it's a real pleasure to speak to my fellow boaters and colleagues. And again, thank you for the opportunity. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. And I hope you're able to take something useful away from all this. So thank you, Don, and thank you, Peter.
You're very welcome. Don? Thanks very much indeed. I hope everybody enjoyed this presentation. I most certainly did. Fantastic. Don?
Inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.